Let's dive right into this explainer. Picture this. You've got two Caterpillar C175-16 engines, the exact same engine, running the exact same hardware. But they need two completely different maintenance calendars. Why? It all comes down to one single thing: how they're actually used. If you accidentally mix up a standby power schedule with a prime power schedule, well, you're either going to waste a ton of money over-servicing a unit that barely runs, or, way worse, you'll severely underservice an engine that is literally working its heart out every single day.
And that brings us to a really common question, one that honestly trips up a lot of seasoned technicians and fleet managers. Does less runtime mean less maintenance? There's this huge yet entirely false assumption out there that if an engine runs less, it just automatically needs less maintenance across the board. We kind of just assume that a machine sitting quietly in the corner isn't wearing out. But as we're going to see in just a second, the engineering reality of the C175 platform tells a completely different story.
To get why that is, we've got to clearly define the two operational realities here. First up, we have the standby application. This generator sits mostly idle. It's basically an insurance policy, just waiting for an emergency. Then, on the flip side, we have the prime application. This unit runs constantly, pulling a real, heavy industrial load every single day. Because their day-to-day lives are so radically different, it makes absolute sense that their maintenance clocks have to tick at entirely different rates.
All right, Section 1, the service interval table. Let's look at the actual numbers.
Okay, let's look at the hard data side by side, because a pretty wild pattern emerges here. Look at the top row. An oil sample, or SOS, is required every 300 hours for both standby and prime. Sure, that makes perfect sense. Now, for the engine oil and filter, standby needs it at 500 hours or 1 year, while prime stretches out to 600 hours. The valve lash check? That makes logical sense too. Standby is 2,400 hours, and prime needs it twice as often, at 1,200 hours because, well, it's running so much more. But look at that bottom row. This is the part that blows people's minds. Standby actually requires more frequent fuel secondary filter service and operating hours every 500 hours, compared to prime's 1,200 hours. No way, right? Think about that for a second. The engine that runs less actually needs its fuel filters changed sooner in its hourly life cycle.
Section 2, the why. Garage car versus taxi. Let's make sense of this.
So why on earth would an engine with fewer running hours demand more frequent filter changes? Let's use an analogy to make this super clear. Think of the standby unit as a garage car. It just sits idle in the dark most of the year. During all that downtime, moisture accumulates, the fuel actually degrades right there in the lines, and contamination builds up. Then, bam, suddenly there's an emergency, and it gets hit with immediate, extreme hard use at full load. That is incredibly harsh on a fuel system. Now, the prime unit is way more like a taxi. It's in constant use. It operates in a steady, totally predictable pattern. The fluids are continuously circulating, continuously burning clean. So weirdly enough, the continuous operation of the prime unit is actually way easier on the fuel filters than the stagnant sit-and-wait life of the standby unit.
And here is why ignoring this logic is so dangerous. Let's look at this number, 6. What does this actually mean for us? Well, imagine a facility messes up and applies the prime power schedule's 1,200-hour fuel filter interval to their standby unit. If that standby unit only racks up, say, 200 hours a year, it would take roughly 6 entire years to reach that 1,200-hour mark. That's 6 years of moisture, organic growth, and fuel degradation literally just sitting and festering in those filters. You'd be facing massive low-pressure contamination issues long before that unit ever saw a wrench.
All right, Section 3, the logbook test. Time to put this into practice.
Okay, here's a real-world scenario for you. You're auditing a logbook for a standby generator. You flip it open and see that it has only accumulated 180 running hours over the past 14 months. Based on the schedule we just walked through, is the engine oil and filter service due? Think about the limits we just covered. Got your answer? The answer is absolutely yes. It is past due.
And the reason why is this golden rule, the whichever comes first rule. For standby applications, you have to always apply whichever limit hits first, the engine operating hours or the calendar limit. Because 14 months obviously exceeds the 1-year calendar limit for an engine oil and filter service on a standby C175, that service is due right now. The fact that it only has a measly 180 hours on the dial doesn't matter at all. The calendar beat the clock.
Moving on to Section 4, precision under pressure.
Because look, knowing exactly when to execute your maintenance is really only half the battle. If you don't know how precisely it needs to be executed, all that scheduling won't save you.
And honestly, nowhere is precision more critical on the C175 than in the mechanical valve train. We're talking about extreme engineering here. This platform has immense power density, and because of that, it leaves literally zero margin for error. Check this out. The valve lash tolerance is an incredibly tight, plus or minus 0.08 millimeters. Let me just emphasize that. A lash setting that you might consider close enough on an older, lower pressure engine that is going to measurably degrade performance and heavily accelerate long-term wear on the C175. No exceptions. Let's look at the exact specs. Inlet valve lash absolutely must be set to 0.80 millimeters. Exhaust valve lash, that's set to 1.30 millimeters. And once you painstakingly find that perfect measurement, the lock nut has to be torqued to exactly 120 Newton meters. If a tech sets the exhaust lash to, let's say, 1.10 millimeters instead of the required 1.30, that tiny, microscopic clearance error is going to compound over thousands of operating hours. You are accelerating valve seat wear way before you ever hit the next scheduled 1,200 or 2,400 hour interval check.
You see this setup here? You need a dial indicator for this step. This is definitely not a job for a standard feeler gauge and a good guess. I like to think of the technician doing this work kind of like a professional piano tuner. A master piano tuner doesn't just tune a grand piano by ear alone, right? They use precise tuning forks and gauges to hit an exact, repeatable frequency on every single string, because close enough sounds terrible. Well, the C175's mechanical valve train works the exact same way. You measure it down to the hundredth of a millimeter to ensure the engine performs exactly to spec.
So we've covered the different intervals, and we've seen the insane level of exactness required. I'm going to leave you with this final thought. You now know the maintenance schedule, but do you have the mechanical discipline to execute a plus or minus 0.08 millimeter valve lash tolerance? Knowing the timeline is one thing. Truly mastering the engine is a whole other ballgame. Keep that in mind, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.